On June 21, 1941, more than 2.7 million Red Army soldiers manned positions along the Soviet western frontier. On paper, they held the advantage over their German counterparts in both tanks and aircraft. Within 3 weeks, 417,729 of those men would be killed or captured inside a single encirclement, whole armies wiped from the order of battle. This is the story of how the pre-war Red Army never lost a battle. It was simply annihilated as an institution. On the evening of June 21, 1941, a Red Army soldier posted to the Western Special Military District settles into his barracks near the Polish frontier. Official propaganda has drilled into him that Germany remains a partner under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. His formation belongs to a force that looks unbeatable on paper. 2.7 million Soviet troops, more than 12,000 tanks, and 9,000 aircraft deployed across the frontier military districts. His officers assure him the Wehrmacht is actually outnumbered. He assumes tomorrow will bring nothing but another day of peacetime drill. What he cannot know is that his entire reality is built on a fiction constructed by Stalin himself. Those staggering figures, more than 12,000 tanks, 9,000 aircraft, conceal a disastrous truth. Roughly 1,000 of those 12,782 tanks are modern T-34s or KV-1s. These are the vehicles whose angled armor deflects German anti-tank rounds. These are the machines that should strike fear into the Wehrmacht. But only 1,000 of them exist, spread across 2,000 kilometers of border. The remainder are aging T-26s and BT-7s, 1930s designs with thin plating and obsolete armament. Worse still, only 60 to 70% of these tanks are even operational. The rest sit idle in repair yards, awaiting spare parts that will never arrive. So when the attack comes, most Soviet tanks will never enter combat. His mechanized corps carries fuel sufficient for just 1 to 2 days of fighting. Not weeks. Not even a single week. 1 to 2 days. Once that burns through, the EU tanks become immobile steel tombs. The ammunition dumps and fuel reserves meant to sustain his unit sit just 20 to 40 kilometers from the border. That is a 30-minute drive for German panzers. These stockpiles were staged for offensive operations, Stalin's plan to eventually strike westward. But now they are perfectly positioned for rapid German seizure. So when the panzers arrive, Soviet formations will exhaust their bullets and fuel inside 48 to 72 hours. His commanding officers, General Dmitry Pavlov leading the Western District, General Mikhail Kirponos heading the Kiev District, General Fyodor Kuznetsov over the Baltic, all carry the same unbearable weight. They operate under explicit standing orders from Stalin. Do not mobilize. Do not assume defensive postures. Observe peacetime protocols. Any measure that could be read as provoking Germany is strictly prohibited. Pavlov has seen the intelligence reports. Numerous sources identify German buildups along the frontier. Agent. Networks transmit detailed assessments. Defectors cross the border carrying specific dates for the invasion, but Stalin has made his stance unmistakable. These warnings are provocations fabricated to lure the Soviet Union into breaking the pact. So Pavlov cannot order his men to dig in. He cannot scatter his aircraft. He cannot move his supply caches from the border. He can only stand by and watch the noose tighten around forces he commands but cannot protect. The communications network linking this soldier to his chain of command is a catastrophic weakness waiting to be exposed. Vulnerable telephone cables run forward to frontline units, while limited radio sets are concentrated at higher headquarters. The Red Army functions on telephone connections, not radio networks. Once those wires are severed, entire armies will fall deaf and mute. So our soldier sleeps on the night of June 21st. He takes comfort in the overwhelming numbers he's been taught to trust. He does not know that. The command apparatus meant to direct those numbers has already been crippled by directives from Moscow. He does not know that Stalin's purges of 1937 to 1938 eliminated or imprisoned the seasoned officers who might have challenged those directives. He does not know that his superiors are untested men elevated far beyond their ability, stepping into the boots of the executed. He does not know that within hours, everything will burn. The Soviet soldier wakes not to morning reveille, but to the ground convulsing beneath him. German guns open fire along the entire frontier. He sprints to his command post seeking orders, but the telephone lines are silent. Destroyed by the opening bombardment and by Luftwaffe strikes targeting communication nodes. His officers have zero contact with headquarters. Runners are sent out. Many are never heard from again. Nobody knows what is happening beyond their immediate position. The war has started, but the Red Army has already lost its central nervous system. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Special Military District, physically cannot reach his own armies within hours of the assault. He lifts the receiver. Nothing. He dispatches messengers. They vanish into the pandemonium. The rigid chain of command that once connected Moscow to the frontline foxhole has simply evaporated. Pavlov tries to organize counterstrikes. He orders his mechanized corps forward, but each corps attacks independently, waging its own blind fight with no awareness of the others. So the Soviet counteroffensives are annihilated piecemeal, one corps at a time, each crushed before the next can arrive. And then the aerial onslaught. Over 1,200 Soviet aircraft are obliterated on the ground within the first day. Most lined up in orderly rows out in the open, completely unprotected. They never leave the tarmac. Why? Because Stalin's directives prohibited alert status. Dispersing the planes might antagonize Germany. Constructing revetments might signal doubt about the pact. So the Luftwaffe secures total air superiority by midday on June 22nd. Soviet pilots rush to their airstrips only to find smoldering debris. Some aircraft detonate as fuel is being pumped in. Others are torn apart by strafing runs before their engines turn over. A handful get airborne, but they face odds of 10 to 1. By sunset, the Soviet Air Force across the western districts has effectively been erased. Within 48 hours, the ammunition and fuel depots positioned just 20 to 40 kilometers from the frontier are captured or demolished. Soviet mechanized corps with fuel for only 1 to 2 days of operations run empty before they can close with the enemy. Tank crews abandon perfectly functional T-34s and KV-1s, not from battle damage, not from engine failure, because the fuel gauges read 0 and no resupply is coming. The Germans seize intact Soviet hardware by the hundreds, tanks loaded with full ammunition, artillery that never discharged a round, warehouses packed with supplies, all abandoned by formations that disintegrate while trying to flee on foot. The magnitude of the carnage reaches an industrial tempo. Average Soviet losses hit 15,000 to 20,000 troops per day across the opening 3 weeks. During the major encirclements, those figures spiked to 40,000 to 50,000 per day. This is not warfare. This is the systematic destruction of organizational coherence. Whole divisions vanish, not because they are beaten in battle, but because they cease to function as formations capable of accepting orders, coordinating maneuver, or sustaining logistics. A division commander attempts to call a withdrawal, but his radios are dead and the phone cables are severed. He sends motorcycle dispatch riders. They are strafed by Stukas. He tries to march his division eastward, but the roads are jammed with refugees, shattered units, and wrecked vehicles. His troops have no ammunition. His armor has no fuel. His guns have no shells. So his division simply disintegrates into thousands of lone soldiers stumbling toward home. As communications collapsed and fuel stocks emptied, Soviet formations confronted a fresh nightmare. Watching German panzer columns race past their positions, driving deep behind the lines, sealing the trap from the rear. The Soviet soldier hears the unmistakable growl of tank engines. He braces for contact. But the German armor does not assault his position. It rolls past, heading east. Within 48 hours, the horrifying realization sets in. He is no longer on the front line. He is behind it. The encirclement is closing. This is the operational genius and human devastation of the German pincer. Army Group Center has deployed 50 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions. They are not grinding through every Soviet strongpoint. They are sweeping around them. The panzers race past forward positions. They thrust deep into the rear at speeds that outstrip any Soviet reaction. Their goal is not to fight. It is to surround. German Panzer Commander Heinz Guderian observes his tanks covering 80 kilometers in 2 days. His crews report something remarkable. Soviet units are not falling back in order. They are not establishing defensive lines. They are simply there, sitting in their positions, waiting for orders that will never reach them. Periodically, his tanks encounter T-34s and KV-1s. German rounds ricochet off the sloped armor. These Soviet tanks are virtually impervious. But these modern vehicles are too scarce. Perhaps 1,000 among the 12,782 Soviet tanks in the border districts. And they are poorly coordinated. They fight alone or in small clusters. No infantry accompaniment, no fuel for sustained operations, no overarching tactical plan. So even when German crews face superior Soviet machines, they prevail through coordination, radio discipline, and combined arms doctrine that converts isolated engagements into systematic encirclement. By early July, the Bialystok-Minsk pocket snaps shut around 417,729 Soviet soldiers. That is the equivalent of losing more than 40 divisions in 2 weeks. By July 9th, 290,000 are taken prisoner, over 4,800 tanks destroyed or abandoned, over 9,000 artillery pieces gone. The Soviet soldier discovers his position has become a pocket inside a larger pocket. German infantry presses in from the west. Panzer spearheads seal the roads east. The Luftwaffe commands the skies. Soviet formations do not withdraw in order because organization no longer exists. Entire armies are severed from supply and command. They splinter into isolated clusters. Some try to fight eastward. Most fail. The routes are choked with broken columns, abandoned equipment, and civilians fleeing the advance. No fuel for whatever tanks still function. No ammunition for sustained engagement. No link to higher command for any coherent response. The trap has shut, and inside the trap, a new horror takes shape. The Soviet soldier crouches in a forest clearing, encircled. His ammunition is almost spent. He hears the Stukas wheeling overhead. Their wailing sirens shriek before every diving run. His unit has no rations, no contact with command, no prospect of resupply. He faces 2 options: try to punch through German lines under cover of darkness, or wait for capture and near certain death in a prisoner camp. This is existence inside the Kessel, the Cauldron, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers endure a triple ordeal that transforms military defeat into organized slaughter. The first ordeal, the Luftwaffe. Stuka dive bombers strike in continuous rotation. They orbit the contracting pockets like birds of prey. Their sirens are engineered for terror, a howling scream that heralds death from the sky. German artillery hammers the trapped formations. There is no Soviet air protection because 1,200 aircraft were shattered on the ground on June 22nd. There is no anti-aircraft ammunition because the depots were seized in the first 72 hours. So the men inside the pockets can only scratch out shallow foxholes and endure until the bombing subsides. The second ordeal, hunger. Soviet formations went into action carrying perhaps 3 to 5 days of rations. Now, a week has passed, then 2. The supply convoys were destroyed or captured. The mobile kitchens were ditched during the retreat. Men chew on grass. They strip bark from trees. They slaughter horses and eat the meat uncooked because cooking fires draw Stuka attacks. One lieutenant records in his journal, "We have not eaten in 4 days. The men lack the strength for a breakout. We simply sit and wait." The third ordeal, the decision. Some soldiers try to escape in small parties. They move after dark through German positions. They navigate by the stars. They keep off the roads. Most are cut down. German machine guns rake them in the blackness, or they penetrate the first perimeter only to hit a second or a third. Those who surrender face a different death warrant. German prisoner camps where more than half of Soviet captives will perish from starvation, exposure, and calculated neglect. The Soviet Union had never ratified the Geneva Convention, so German guards handle Soviet prisoners not as soldiers, but as subhuman enemies to be labored to death or starved into oblivion. It is not a choice between ways to survive. It is a choice between ways to die. The pattern replicates along the entire battlefront with factory-like precision. The Smolensk engagements through July and August pile on another 300,000 to 350,000 Soviet casualties. At minimum, 180,000 are netted in various encirclements. In late July, the Uman pocket closes, snaring roughly 103,000 more men. These are not conventional setbacks followed by orderly withdrawals and regrouping. These are killing grounds where entire field armies stop existing as organized combat forces. Were the soldiers who fell asleep on June 21st, certain they belonged to an invincible war machine, wake up trapped in an inferno with no exit? In Moscow, the hunt for someone to blame gets underway. General Dmitry Pavlov, who had struggled to mount a defense despite losing contact with his armies within hours of the attack, is summoned back in early July. He faces a court-martial on charges of cowardice and criminal dereliction. In late July 1941, barely a month after the onslaught, Pavlov is executed by firing squad. The calamity that Stalin's own directives engineered now has a designated scapegoat. Even as the catastrophe keeps spiraling, even as hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers perish in the cauldrons, Stalin pinned the blame on the generals he had shackled. Kirponos would be killed attempting a breakout in September. Kuznetsov was stripped of his command. The apparatus that manufactured the disaster perpetuated itself by devouring its own victims. The Soviet soldier from June 21st, assuming he survived, would be a changed man by August. His formation is gone. His officers are dead or in captivity. The army he belonged to no longer functions. He's become part of a frantic improvisation, a replacement Red Army being assembled on the fly from anyone who can carry a weapon. By mid-July 1941, just 3 weeks into the onslaught, the Soviet Union had suffered losses equal to its entire pre-war standing force in the western districts. Upward of 2 million casualties, 417,729 men swallowed in the Bialystok-Minsk pocket alone. Another 103,000 encircled at Uman. The Smolensk fighting would contribute 300,000 to 350,000 more. These were not merely entries on a casualty ledger. They represented the total obliteration of organizational frameworks. Veteran cadres developed across 2 decades, equipment reserves reflecting years of factory output, all gone, not through extended attrition, but through swift encirclement and institutional collapse. The peacetime Red Army simply ceased to exist. The scope of this devastation forced responses that verged on the apocalyptic. Emergency conscription of raw recruits. Men who had never touched a rifle shoved into the line within days. Factory workers hauled from assembly floors. Peasants pulled from their harvests, handed a uniform, handed a weapon if one was available, ordered to halt the Germans or die trying. The mass relocation of entire industrial bases eastward, plants torn down and loaded onto rail cars as German armor closed in. Machinery shipped to the Urals, workers and families evacuated. Whole manufacturing cities rebuilt 1,000 kilometers east. Defensive engagements fought not by career soldiers, but by whoever could be assembled. Factory militias, officer school cadets, punishment battalions, prison inmates handed rifles and promised sentence reductions if they survived. The Soviet Union was reconstructing its military while waging a war for survival, building new divisions from untested conscripts, even as the old ones perished in the cauldrons. This disaster had a designer. Stalin's pre-war decisions manufactured the conditions for the swiftest military disintegration in modern history. The purges that removed experienced commanders, men who might have resisted his orders against mobilization, the forward deployment doctrine that positioned whole armies within easy reach of encirclement, built for aggression, not defense. The ban on mobilization that left units locked at peacetime readiness, forbidden to prepare positions or scatter their aircraft. And when the unavoidable catastrophe arrived, Stalin turned on the officers he had rendered helpless. The system that produced the disaster ensured its own survival by feeding on its victims. The launch of Barbarossa was not the start of the Soviet war effort. It was the violent destruction of the Soviet peacetime military and the emergence of something fundamentally different, forged in catastrophe, forged in industrial-scale human sacrifice. The pre-war Red Army died inside the cauldrons of 1941. From its remains would rise the force that eventually march to Berlin. But that metamorphosis would demand millions of additional lives. It would redefine the boundaries of human suffering in modern conflict. By mid-July 1941, more than 2.7 million Soviet soldiers had gone from peacetime routine to wholesale destruction in barely 3 weeks. The organizational structures, experienced cadres, and equipment reserves assembled over 2 decades were erased, not in heroic final stands, but through methodical encirclement and institutional disintegration. 417,729 men in one pocket, 103,000 in another, 180,000 more at Smolensk. Every figure representing not just casualties, but the total elimination of military formations that had existed for years. The fastest military collapse in modern history started not with a battle, but with a telephone wire being severed. It concluded with the pre-war Red Army ceasing to exist and millions more deaths yet to come. If this story held your attention, hit subscribe for more World War II deep dives. Posted every week. Thanks for watching.